So let's talk about John Calvin. So we have these two, what we call magisterial main branches of the Reformation. Why do we call them magisterial? Because both Luther and the Calvin recognize the legitimacy of the secular state, what we today would call the secular state. And they each had their own sort of theory of that. But they did not advocate the overthrow of the princes per se. They recognized that the princes, the rulers, the secular rulers had some authority derived from God, and that Christians and the church had some responsibility, to obey them. We'll see in a moment the Radical Reformation had a different idea. Okay, so Calvin. A few things that we want to talk about from Calvin that are really important. Calvin emphasizes the validity of every calling. Now, Luther did this as well, but Calvin has a somewhat different take on it from Luther. Now, to put this in context, remember that a little while ago when I was talking about sex and celibacy and the notion that those who are celibate, who are committed to the church vocationally full-time, priests, bishops, monks, the notion was they had kind of a higher calling than the ordinary person. And in many ways, that was related to some of these Platonic ideas that we talked about in last class, which is, the intellectual contemplative life is more important in some ways than the embodied life. So there's streams of thought like that from the patristic period through the medieval period with varying degrees of nuance. And Calvin, Luther also, but Calvin says that is not the case. The pastor has his own calling. The farmer has his own calling. The miller and the baker and so on each have their own callings, and all of these callings are equally valid. The question isn't whether one calling is higher than another. It's just the question of what God has called you to. And this, again, is going to be an important theme for Christian ethics. It always has been, and it probably always will be. But it's this question of how do we actually live out our lives? Is it legitimate to live out your life sort of just doing the ordinary things that a merchant or a baker would do? Of course, tithing into the church and so on. But is that just as valid as being a pastor or a priest or an evangelist or whatever? Okay, Calvin also wrestles with this question of law. I want you to see that all of Christian ethics wrestles with this question of law, moral law, and then from the moral law, the application of that into society as positive law. Calvin has this notion of the three uses of the law, and what Calvin wants to say about those three uses of the law is that the law displays sin. It does show up how we fall short, but that's not all it does, right? And there is a sense in Luther's thought that that's really the main function of the law. It shows how we fall short so we can seek grace. And then as we seek grace, we can begin to live more righteously. But Calvin wants to say, yes, it does that, but also it has a very fundamental role in maintaining civic order, and that really without good law that is in some way reflective of the moral law, civic order, society will fall apart. And it's part of God's providential plan that there will be civic order until the eschaton. And Calvin will also say that the law has a place in the Christian life as a stimulus to actual obedience as we begin through grace and through preaching and teaching of the church and through reading scripture to understand better what God's desire for us is, how we should live. We can actually begin to do that. That's a bit subtly different. Luther would also say that, but it's subtly different from how Luther would say that comes about, and it's also somewhat different from how someone like Aquinas would say that would come about. Now, notice I'm not here talking about Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Of course, Calvin's doctrine of predestination is really important to his thought, and exactly what he meant about it is really important to his thought. But, there is not a sense in which certainly ethically, Calvin thinks human beings are responsible for their conduct. Calvin does try to preserve a kind of complementarian freedom within his doctrine of providence. Whether he ultimately succeeds in that or not is kind of a question for maybe a different class. But at least here, within the backdrop of his sense of what providence means, he does have these indications about callings and responding to callings in the law and responding to law. The other key piece of this is civil government. Now, Calvin sees the church and the civil government, theology and civil government, as being closely intertwined, and is directly involved in the governance of the city of Geneva in present-day Switzerland, to the point even where in a very famous and kind of gruesome episode, Calvin oversaw the burning at the stake of a alleged heretic. Kind of reluctantly. It's just kind of a terrible story. If you take a church history class with me, we talk about it. But in any event, it was that closely entwined that Calvin would have agreed with someone like Ambrose that if there's perceived heresy, the civil order might have a role in enforcing against that.